Tab 1. In the early spring of 1981, a 34-year-old man named Carl McCunn decided to embark on an adventure that most people would find completely terrifying. Carl was a professional wildlife photographer and he lived in Anchorage, Alaska. He was an incredibly talented photographer and he had a deep, lifelong love for the natural world. He wanted to capture the beauty of the Alaskan wilderness in a way that nobody else had before. So, he planned a massive 5-month-long solo camping trip. He chose a spot that was extremely remote, way up in northern Alaska, actually inside the Arctic Circle. This was not a place where you could just drive a car or hike in from a highway. The only way to get there was by hiring a small bush plane. A pilot flew Carl out and dropped him off next to a beautiful, unnamed lake. This lake was surrounded on all sides by thick forests and massive, snow-covered mountains. Once the plane buzzed away and disappeared over the horizon, Carl was completely on his own. There were no roads, no phones, no park rangers, and no other human beings for at least 100 miles in any direction. This was true, absolute isolation, but Carl loved it. He set up his tent near the edge of the lake and began his daily routine. For 5 months, Carl did not see or speak to another living soul. He spent his days hiking through the forests, tracking wild animals, and taking hundreds of photographs. He was extremely successful on this trip. He managed to shoot over 500 rolls of film. Carl knew that once he got back to civilization, he could sell these photographs to magazines and collectors for a lot of money. This was his dream, and he was living it. He had spent months carefully documenting the migration of birds, the behavior of moose, and the stunning mountain landscapes. He was incredibly proud of the work he had done. He kept his rolls of film carefully stored in waterproof, protective containers inside his gearboxes. To Carl, those rolls of film represented his entire future, but the problem was, Carl had a very specific personality trait that would end up playing a major role in what was to come. He was a fiercely independent person, sometimes to a fault. He did not like people checking up on him or worrying about him. In fact, on a previous trip, Carl had been late returning home. His father had gotten incredibly worried and called the police to report him missing. When Carl finally came back and realized what his dad had done, he was actually very angry. He felt that his father had overreacted and embarrassed him. He sat his father down and told him to never do that again. He said that if he was ever late, he was fine and his dad should absolutely not contact the authorities under any circumstances. Carl wanted to handle everything himself, and he did not want anyone fussing over him. His father, wanting to respect his son's wishes, agreed to step back. This strict rule would end up having devastating consequences because nobody back home was actively tracking Carl's return date or worrying about where he was. Fast forward to the morning of August 7th, 1981. This was supposed to be the very last day of Carl's 5-month trip. He stood on the edge of the lake looking out at the calm water. The wilderness was completely silent. The quiet was so deep that even the smallest sound felt incredibly loud. Carl picked up a small cardboard box of ammunition from his gear. He looked at it for a second, and then he threw it as hard as he could out into the middle of the lake. It made a loud splash that echoed off the trees and the mountains, and then he did it again. He threw another box and then another. He ended up throwing 5 boxes of ammunition into the deep water of the lake, watching them sink down to the muddy bottom. Now, you might wonder why a guy who was totally alone in the middle of the Arctic Circle would throw away perfectly good ammunition. Well, Carl had a very logical reason for doing this. He was expecting a friend named Rory to pick him up that day in a very small bush plane. Carl knew that these tiny planes had very strict weight limits. He had his massive tent, his heavy winter sleeping bag, all of his cooking gear, and most importantly, his 500 rolls of film. The film was heavy, and it was his most valuable possession. Carl figured that since his trip was over, he did not need all this extra ammunition anymore. He had brought plenty of bullets for hunting and protection, but now he wanted to lighten his load as much as possible. To make sure Rory's plane would not be overweight, Carl decided to get rid of the heavy boxes of bullets. It was a practical decision to make room for his photography. Carl was about to throw his 6th and final box of ammunition into the water when he suddenly froze. From the other side of the lake, deep in the dark forest, he heard the long, low howl of a wild wolf. It was a chilling sound that reminded him just how wild and dangerous this place really was. Carl looked down at the last box of ammunition in his hand. He decided that, just in case, he would hold on to this one. He slipped the box of bullets into his backpack, thinking it was always smart to have at least some protection until he was safely inside the plane. After that, Carl walked along the shoreline to check a net he had set up in the water. He was happy to see he had caught 2 healthy trout. He pulled the fish out of the net, went back to his campsite, and started a small fire. As he sat there cooking the fish, he kept looking up at the sky. He was listening carefully for the distant hum of an airplane engine. He did not know the exact time Rory was coming, only that the pickup was scheduled for today, August 7th. After eating, he sat down and wrote a quick entry in his diary, talking about how excited he was to finally go home, to see his friends, to call his dad, to be back in a warm house. By mid-afternoon, Carl had finished packing up all of his things. He carried his heavy storage trunks and bags down to the water's edge and piled them up, ready to be loaded onto the plane. Then he sat down on one of his trunks and waited. Hours passed. The afternoon faded into evening, and still there was no sound of a plane. In the Arctic during the summer, the sun stays up for nearly 20 hours a day. But eventually, Carl noticed the sun was finally starting to dip below the horizon. That meant it was close to midnight. His heart began to sink. Midnight meant August 7th was officially over. Rory had missed the pickup date. Carl had no way to call anyone. He had no radio and no phone. He had to unpack his tent, set it up again in the cold, and go to sleep, hoping the plane would show up the next morning. But the next day came and went, and then another day and another. No plane ever came. As the days stretched on, Carl sat in his tent, trying to figure out what went wrong. And then a sickening realization hit him. He remembered a conversation he had with Rory 6 months earlier, before the trip even started. They had been sitting in a bar, drinking beers, laughing, and having a great time. As the drinks kept coming, Carl had asked Rory if he could fly out and pick him up on August 7th. Rory had smiled and said that he could probably do that, but he would need to check his schedule first to make absolutely sure. Carl, in his excitement to get the trip started, had completely forgotten to follow up with Rory. He had never called to confirm the date. He had just assumed Rory would show up. Now, the horrible truth set in. Rory was not late. Rory was not coming at all. At this point, Carl was truly alone, facing an incredibly dangerous situation. But before we find out what happened to Carl in the freezing wilderness, let me tell you about a brand new podcast from MrBallen Studios called Redacted Declassified Mysteries. This show is hosted by the incredible Luke Lemann. From covert government experiments to bizarre assassination attempts, Redacted dives deep into the astonishing true stories of uncovered secrets, lies, and deception within the world's most powerful institutions. Governments and military services around the globe have always cloaked themselves in secrecy. But history shows that when you try too hard to hide something, it only makes people more curious. Luke and his team have spent months researching these totally true and thoroughly twisted tales guaranteed to keep you on the edge of your seat. You will hear stories like the mind-bending truth behind Operation Paperclip, where former Nazi scientists were smuggled into America to advance U.S. technology and intelligence during the Cold War. Or the shocking story of Charles Manson and the CIA, revealing how a notorious cult leader might have been entangled in a web of covert operations. Trust me when I tell you, the stories are real and the secrets are shocking. Follow Redacted Declassified Mysteries with Luke Lemann on the Wondery app or wherever else you get your podcasts. You can listen ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app or on Spotify. And so, we go back to the end of August, and Carl was still stuck out in the Alaskan wilderness. By now, Carl had fully accepted that Rory was not going to come pick him up. He was doing his best not to fixate on his stupid mistake, but he knew he had to make a choice. He figured he had two options. The first choice was to stay put. This was the conservative option. He knew how to get food by fishing and setting snares. There was plenty of firewood nearby. He knew he could keep himself from starving or freezing to death for a while, but staying put would not actually get him rescued. He would just be waiting for a miracle. He would have to endure the harsh weather and pray that someone eventually realized he was gone. The second choice was to pack up his campsite and attempt to hike 75 miles to the nearest city, which was called Fort Yukon. This choice could actually get him home, but it came with a much higher chance of death. Those 75 miles were over extremely rough, untamed terrain with absolutely zero human-made trails. One little slip, one sprained ankle, and he would be helpless. Plus, finding food along the way would be a major gamble. The weather was rapidly turning brutal, and the entire region was teeming with packs of hungry wolves. If he got lost or injured, there would be no shelter and no way to survive the freezing nights. Carl knew both of these choices were terrible, but he was running out of time. The brutal Arctic winter was fast approaching, and if he was going to attempt the hike, he had to do it immediately. As he weighed his options, he walked over to check one of his rabbit snares. He was incredibly relieved to find that he had caught a rabbit. He took it back to his camp, cooked it over the fire, and as he sat there eating, he thought to himself that maybe staying put was the right call. He had food for now, and it would keep him alive for at least a few more days. He figured he could just wait a little longer. It seemed much safer than walking into 75 miles of unknown predator-filled wilderness. But deep down, Carl knew that staying put was not a real long-term solution. Even if he could find food, he was a sitting duck for all the predators in the area, and he only had that one single box of ammunition left to defend himself. If a pack of wolves decided to attack his campsite, he would quickly run out of bullets. But just then, Carl heard the most glorious sound. It was the distant, high-pitched whine of a small airplane engine. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. He had not seen or heard a single plane since he was dropped off 5 months ago. But sure enough, he looked up into the sky, and a second later, he saw a plane flying directly towards his camp. It was flying low and slow. Carl bolted into his tent and grabbed the most brightly colored thing he owned, which was his bright orange sleeping bag. He ran outside to the water's edge and began waving the sleeping bag back and forth over his head as hard as he could to get the pilot's attention. As the plane got closer, Carl could see the markings on the side. It belonged to the Alaska State Troopers. He was filled with absolute joy. He figured his family or friends must have reported him missing after all, and the police were out here looking for him. A moment later, the plane passed directly over Carl's camp. It was so low to the ground that Carl could actually see the pilot looking back at him through the window. Carl looked right into the pilot's eyes. When Carl was nearly certain he had made eye contact, he threw his right fist up into the air in pure excitement and began jumping up and down on the spot. He was screaming with happiness. He was finally saved. He was going home with a massive grin on his face. Carl watched as the plane made a big, wide U-turn over the lake. It made another pass over the camp, once again flying low and slow. Carl assumed the pilot was surveying the area, looking for a safe place to land the plane. Carl rushed back to his tent and began frantically packing up all of his things. He wanted to be ready to load his gear the second the plane touched down. As he packed, he kept looking out over the lake, watching for the plane, but the plane did not land. It just kept flying straight ahead, moving away from Carl's campsite until it disappeared over the snowy mountain peaks on the horizon. The sound of the engine slowly faded away into nothing, and the silence returned. For the rest of the day, Carl stood on the shoreline, staring off into the distance, desperately hoping the plane would come back. But it never did. He could not understand why they would fly all the way out here, look right at him, and then just leave. Lying inside his tent that night, Carl could not sleep. He was completely shaken up by what had happened. He did not understand. He had seen the pilot. The pilot had looked right at him. Why didn't they land? Why didn't they stop? Carl tried to comfort himself by thinking that maybe the terrain was just too rough for that specific plane to land. Perhaps the pilot was flying back to a base to get a float plane that could land directly on the water. It was a comforting thought, and it made him feel a little bit better, but he still could not relax enough to sleep. Knowing he was just going to lie awake all night, Carl sat up, turned on his flashlight, and began looking for something to read just to occupy his mind. But Carl had been out in the wilderness for months, and he had been stranded for weeks. He had already read all of his books and magazines a million times. He had even read his own diary a dozen times. There was literally nothing left to read, but as he searched through his gear, his hand brushed against something small. He pulled it out and saw it was his hunting license. It was the one thing he had never closely examined. It was just a small paper certificate filled with rules, regulations, and safety tips. But since he had nothing else, Carl began reading it. He read the front of the license all the way to the bottom. Then he flipped it over and started reading the back. And that was when Carl saw something that made his heart practically stop. At first, he thought he must have misread it. He rubbed his eyes and read the paragraph again, and then he read it a third time. The words were very clear. Carl looked up into the darkness of his tent in absolute shock. He suddenly understood exactly why that pilot had left him. For the next several weeks, Carl stayed close to his camp. He was hoping and praying that somehow another plane would fly over or that the troopers would return. But they never did. And by the time Carl finally accepted the grim reality that the plane was not coming back, it was too late to attempt the 75-mile hike. The winter weather had become too severe, the snow was too deep, and the temperatures were far too low for him to survive a single night without shelter. His only option was to stay put and try to survive, but the situation quickly grew desperate. The lake froze over with thick ice, making it impossible for Carl to catch any fish. His rabbit snares sat empty day after day because the local wolves and foxes were getting to his traps and stealing his catches before he could get to them. He was losing his only sources of food. By October, Carl was getting dangerously skinny. His clothes were hanging loose on his frame, and his energy was fading fast. By November, he was actively starving. Every day was a grueling battle against the freezing cold and the hollow ache in his stomach. On November 26th, which was Thanksgiving Day, Carl lay weak and freezing inside his tent. He made an entry in his diary. There would be no Thanksgiving feast for him that day. His food stores were completely gone. The Arctic winter had become incredibly brutal. The temperature inside the tent was freezing, and Carl's fingers and toes had turned completely black from severe frostbite. He was sick all the time, suffering from constant chills and weakness. As Carl wrote in his diary, he looked out through the open tent flap at his dying fire. He knew he had no more strength left to gather firewood. He was out of options, and he knew he had only one choice left to make. He did not want to suffer through another slow, agonizing night of freezing and starving to death. With trembling hands, Carl scratched one final sentence into his diary. He wrote, "They say it doesn't hurt." Then he carefully set his diary on the floor of the tent right next to his precious 500 rolls of film. He reached over, picked up his rifle, and grabbed his very last box of ammunition. A little while later, a single lonely gunshot rang out across the frozen, silent lake. In early February of 1982, several months after that gunshot, a team of Alaska State Troopers finally flew back to the remote lake. Carl's family had grown deeply concerned after not hearing from him for so long, and they had eventually convinced the authorities to launch a search. When the troopers landed on the ice and walked up to the snow-covered campsite, they found Carl's tent. Inside, they made the tragic discovery of Carl's frozen body. The troopers also found his 500 rolls of film, his rifle, his diary, and his hunting license. As the investigators read through the diary, they were able to reconstruct the entire heartbreaking story of what had actually happened. They read about his hope, his waiting, his joy when the plane arrived, and then his sudden crushing realization. What Carl had only realized on that cold night in his tent was that his enthusiastic fist pump to the state trooper plane had actually sealed his fate. On the back of Carl's hunting license, there was a section detailing the emergency body signals used to communicate with search and rescue aircraft. It explained that raising a single arm in the air or pumping a single fist is the universally recognized hand signal for everything is okay, do not wait, no assistance needed. When the state trooper pilot had flown over Carl's camp back in August, he had indeed made eye contact with Carl. He saw Carl waving his orange sleeping bag, and then he saw Carl raise his single arm and pump his fist in the air. The pilot, following the standard regulations, assumed that Carl was just a happy hunter or photographer who was waving to say hello and signal that he was perfectly fine. So the pilot turned the plane around and flew away, completely unaware of the life or death situation Carl was in. If Carl had only read that hunting license a little bit sooner, he would have known the proper emergency signal. To ask for help, a person must raise both arms in the air, forming a wide V shape, which is the universal sign that means pick me up or I need assistance. It was a simple, tragic misunderstanding that ended up costing Carl his life. The state troopers were devastated when they put the pieces together. The pilot who had flown over the camp was horrified to realize that he had actually looked right at the man who was desperately in need of help, but had mistaken his cries of joy and fist pumps for a sign of safety. The tragedy of the situation weighed heavily on everyone involved. The story of Carl McCunn remains one of the most heartbreaking tales of survival and missed connections in the history of the Alaskan wilderness. His incredible photos were eventually recovered, but the young photographer never made it back to share his stories. His 500 rolls of film stood as a silent testament to his talent and the months he spent in the beautiful, unforgiving North. His family was left to mourn a son and a brother who was lost to a simple, quiet mistake. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Short A photographer vanished deep inside the Arctic Circle, but the strangest clue was a single fist raised to the sky. Carl McCunn, 34, had spent 5 months alone in Alaska capturing 500 rolls of priceless wilderness photos. On pickup day, no plane came. Weeks later, a state trooper plane finally flew overhead. Carl waved wildly, then pumped one fist in relief. The pilot saw him and left. The shocking twist? That gesture meant, I'm okay. No help needed. By the time rescuers returned, Carl was frozen in his tent. His diary revealed everything. Full story on our channel. Tab 1 on the night of March 2, 2006, a 28-year-old police corporal named Sergio Poeta was patrolling a remote dirt road in rural Argentina on his motorcycle. It was pitch black out with no streetlights whatsoever. On either side of the road were mostly vast, open fields, occasionally interspersed with thick patches of forest and dense vegetation with the massive mountains rising up silently in the background. There was absolutely nobody around him for miles. This was a remote area called the Poma, which was incredibly famous for its beautiful natural landscapes and traditional cowboy culture. Sergio was out here patrolling for poachers who came out at night to trap or kill the wild cats, monkeys, and exotic birds that often sold for a lot of money on the black market. It had been an exceptionally quiet night so far, but Sergio knew from experience that the later it got, the more likely it would be that he would catch someone doing something highly illegal. At around 10 o'clock in the evening, Sergio was riding down the road towards the crossroads that locals called El Cruz de las Cañas. Up ahead, in the deep darkness, he saw the red tail lights of a car. At first, it seemed like this car was coming to a stop, but then it turned off the road and drove into a nearby cluster of low trees and thick vegetation about the size of a football field. Then, these tail lights disappeared. Sergio felt his heart start to beat a bit faster because he knew this had to be a poacher. He thought this poacher had seen him and realized he could be a cop, and so was driving off the road and basically trying to hide. Sergio sped up on his motorcycle, and when he reached the spot where this car had left the road, he pulled over and parked. Sergio climbed off his bike and then radioed into headquarters his location and asked for backup. Then he unholstered his gun. He knew this far out it was going to take backup a long time to get here, and Sergio had no intentions of letting these poachers get away. Sergio had a flashlight, but he did not bother to take it out because he did not want to give away his position to whoever was hiding. But in the darkness, Sergio was having a really hard time finding where in this thick vegetation the car had actually gone. There were no broken branches or crushed bushes. The entire vegetation looked completely uniform and intact, and so Sergio, with his gun drawn in front of him, began pacing along the shoulder of this dirt road, looking for tire tracks on the ground. But after looking for a while, he could not find any. There was no indication that a car was ever here or drove into this vegetation, and so eventually Sergio just stopped and listened. He figured the poachers could only have driven a little ways into the trees before stopping, and so he hoped to hear them moving around. But as he stood there, all he could hear was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the crickets and cicadas chirping and buzzing, the hoots of owls, and the long, strange calling sound of birds known as nightjars. Sergio knew if he wanted to catch these poachers, he could not just sit here all night hoping they made a noise. He took a deep breath, stepped off the road, and made his way into the trees. He walked quickly but carefully, moving branches aside with one hand and holding his gun with the other, constantly scanning left and right for any movement or light. And when he was about 100 feet into the trees, he finally saw something out of the corner of his eye. He caught a glint in the darkness, and for a second, it almost looked like moonlight reflecting off of something metal. And so Sergio thought that had to be the car and that he had caught them. But when Sergio turned to face them, he immediately realized there was no car. What he saw was so jarring and terrifying that for a second he just stood there, frozen to the spot. And as he did, the sounds in the forest began to amplify all around him, and he felt this panic building inside of his chest. He wanted to scream, but when he opened his mouth, no sound came out. A few minutes later, an off-duty police officer who was friendly with Sergio was heading to bed in his home when his phone rang. He looked at the screen and saw it was Sergio calling him. So he opened his phone and said hello, but Sergio did not say hello back to him. Instead, in a voice that was unusually cold and monotone, Sergio just said, "Come to Las Canas, you know what to do." And before this other officer could ask Sergio what he meant, the line just went dead. The officer tried to call Sergio back, but Sergio did not answer. The officer really had no idea what was going on here. This was exceptionally odd behavior by Sergio, and so this officer felt compelled to call it into headquarters just in case. The off-duty police officer stared at his phone in disbelief. He tried calling Sergio back 4 or 5 times, but each time it went straight to a busy signal or just kept ringing. The cold, monotone voice lingered in his head, sounding almost like Sergio was speaking under hypnosis or being forced to read a script. It was a voice stripped of all emotion, which was terrifying because Sergio was normally a very lively and expressive person. Knowing that Sergio was patrolling alone in one of the most remote and desolate sectors of the district, the officer knew he could not just ignore this. He got out of bed, threw on his uniform, and decided to call the station. When he explained the situation to the dispatcher's voice tensed up. The dispatcher explained that they had already lost contact with Sergio's radio. In a small, tight-knit department, a lost officer is everyone's worst nightmare. The dispatcher had already sent 3 patrol units to the coordinates Sergio had given during his initial call. The off-duty officer decided he could not sit at home, so he got into his personal vehicle and started driving towards Las Cañas himself, praying that his friend was just having radio trouble and nothing more. But when this officer got the dispatcher on the phone, the dispatcher told him they actually already had backup on their way to Sergio right now. And the dispatcher told him that they were actually pretty worried about Sergio too, because after Sergio's first radio call had come in where he gave his location and asked for backup, they had lost contact with him entirely. Every time they had tried to call him back, he was not answering. Meanwhile, the backup, which consisted of 3 police cars full of heavily armed officers, sped past vast cornfields into the remote area that contained Las Cañas where Sergio had last been. And when they got to the actual spot on the road where Sergio had said he was, they found his motorcycle parked neatly, but Sergio was nowhere to be found, and nobody else was there either. It was just this lone motorcycle. And so the 3 cars pulled over near the motorcycle and the officers got out. One of the officers tried again to hail Sergio on the radio, but again they were met with absolute silence. And so they all fanned out with their flashlights and began searching this road up and down looking for any sign of Sergio in the dark. And after a minute or two, one of the officers spotted this cluster of metal in the sand by the side of the road. Now, this officer did not immediately connect whatever this metal was with whatever happened to Sergio. They just walked over to see what it was. But when he actually reached it and shone his light directly on it, he gasped and called out to the other officers, telling them to come over. Because these pieces of metal definitely had something to do with Sergio. They were the completely disassembled parts of Sergio's radio and his gun. The pieces were lying in a neat pile in the sand, with the small screws and internal components laid out meticulously, which made no logical sense. This discovery immediately launched a major police search operation. More backup poured into Las Cañas, and officers teamed up and continued to search the dark area. And pretty quickly, officers found what looked like Sergio's footprints heading away from the road and into the cluster of trees. So the officers began to follow them. However, after getting about 100 feet into the trees following these footsteps, they noticed something very strange. The footprints were getting further and further apart. At first, the officers thought that maybe Sergio began sprinting and taking really big, long strides. But as they continued following these steps through the trees and out the backside into this big field, the distance between these steps continued to get bigger and bigger. Soon, the distance between each footprint was 10 feet, then 15 feet, and then 20 feet. Even if Sergio had been sprinting at full speed and literally leaping, this was too big of a distance for any person to cover. This was literally humanly impossible. The police officers following these prints looked at each other uneasily. Each footprint was perfectly clear in the soft ground, and there was no mistaking this was Sergio's boot. And then also, they were certain they were not missing prints in between the ones they could see. They really were spaced this far apart, as if he was being carried or thrown. The officers had been talking to each other when they began following these prints, but now they just walked in absolute silence, overwhelmed by the eerie nature of the trail. For more than a mile, they tracked Sergio's bizarre, seemingly impossible trail through open fields and clusters of trees until they arrived at a large cornfield. And then suddenly, the trail of footprints just stopped. The last clear mark was a deep imprint of his right boot, and then nothing. It was like Sergio had pushed off his right foot and then just vanished into the air. The search for Sergio went on all night, despite the fact that it started to pour rain at around 2 o'clock in the morning, making the search conditions miserable. The officers never gave up, shining their flashlights through the mud and rain. However, beyond those footsteps, they never found any other trace of Sergio. And there was one other thing police could not find. There was absolutely no sign of the poachers that Sergio had called in before he had vanished. There were no tire tracks from any vehicle other than Sergio's motorcycle. There was no broken vegetation or anything like that. It looked like no car had ever been driven into these trees. And there were no signs of any kind of struggle either that would explain why Sergio was gone and why his gun and radio were disassembled by the side of the road. The whole situation just made absolutely no sense. At 4:30 in the afternoon on March 3rd, 2006, so roughly 18 hours after Sergio had disappeared, a farmer was walking on his property about 12 miles away from Las Cañas when he looked up ahead and saw this dark figure sitting by the side of the road. The farmer squinted to get a better look, and the figure looked like a man, but he was all curled up into a ball and he was sitting directly in the mud. Now, keep in mind this area is deep in the middle of nowhere, and so this farmer did not get a lot of people passing through his land. And so to see anybody out here was pretty rare, let alone what he was seeing now. And so feeling curious, the farmer called out to this man but did not get any response. And so he just started walking towards him. And when he got up close, he saw this man was a police officer in full uniform. He had his knees pulled up to his chest with his arms wrapped tightly around them, and his head was buried in his lap, and so the farmer could not see his face. And weirdly, even though it had only recently stopped raining and the ground that the officer was sitting on was still wet and muddy, this man and his uniform were totally dry, with no mud or water on his clothes. The farmer leaned down and gently put his hand on the man's shoulder and asked if he was okay. But the officer did not react at all. He just stayed there motionless, head in his lap, not reacting, totally silent. And this was just too strange. The farmer backed away, took out his phone, and he called the police. It did not take long for the police to show up and identify this seated police officer as Sergio Poeta. But Sergio would not talk to the police any more than he would speak to the farmer. He did not appear to be physically injured, but there was definitely something wrong with his mental state. So the officers called an ambulance and they summoned Sergio's boss, the police chief, to see if he could get Sergio to respond in any way. And when Sergio's boss showed up, he was able to coax Sergio up off the wet ground, but still Sergio would not speak a single word. All he would do is give his boss a big hug and just break down and cry. So his boss led Sergio over to the ambulance, which had just arrived, and he got him in the back and he sat with him, and then he went with Sergio to the hospital and followed him into his exam room. At first, inside the exam room, Sergio did not want anybody to touch him and he was very anxious and paranoid. He kept squinting and grimacing every time the lights were put on him as if they were causing him physical pain. But after a few minutes, he did let the doctors and nurses remove his clothes and examine his body for wounds. Sergio's boss had expected that Sergio would have severe injuries. He figured he had likely been assaulted, beaten, or kidnapped by aggressive poachers. But as he watched the doctors and nurses check Sergio out, it was very clear that Sergio did not have any external injuries. There were no bruises, no cuts, and no sign of any physical struggle at all. And not only that, as the nurse took Sergio's vitals, it was clear that he was not dehydrated or sick at all, despite the fact he had just been missing for 18 hours with no food or water supplies. The only injury the medical team did find on Sergio was to his feet, but it did not help clarify anything. When they removed Sergio's boots and socks, they found these bizarre, deep burns on the soles of his feet. It looked like he had been standing directly on an incredibly hot surface. Over the next couple of hours, Sergio did finally begin to talk, and here is the totally wild story that he told the investigators. At 10 o'clock the night before, when Sergio had followed the poachers into the trees, he had been absolutely certain that he had seen the metal of the poacher's car reflecting the moonlight. However, he did not. There was no car, and there were no poachers. When he turned to face the clearing, all he saw in the darkness were two sets of burning red eyes staring back at him. Sergio stood there completely stunned, unsure who or what these eyes belonged to. And then, before he could do anything, the eyes began to glide closer to him. And as they did, Sergio realized with growing horror that these were not human eyes. These were not animal eyes. These eyes belonged to some creature he had never seen before in his entire life. All he could make out beyond the burning red eyes were these slim gray bodies with big heads and long skinny fingers, and they did not appear to blink at all. Sergio opened his mouth to scream, but when he did, no sound came out. And that was when Sergio realized that not only could he not scream, but he no longer was able to move. He was completely paralyzed. But then suddenly, he felt this intense pressure in his torso and his back sort of involuntarily arched in response. He tried to wrench himself free of whatever invisible force seemed to be in control of him, but he could not. It felt like his spine was going to snap. And then he felt himself begin to walk out of the forest backwards. His back was arched in this totally unnatural position, and he was marching out of the trees, completely unable to stop his own legs from moving. And then as he was doing this, he walked helplessly as one of his hands went down and pulled out his phone, and then he dialed the number of that officer. And then this detached, cold voice came out of Sergio's mouth, telling his friend to come to Las Cañas, saying that he knew what to do. And as Sergio continued to walk in this bizarre bent-over gait, he felt himself reach for his gun. And after he drew it, he watched in horror as his hands fully disassembled it and dropped the pieces on the ground, and then he watched himself do the exact same thing with his radio. And the whole time, these red-eyed creatures were just a few feet away, staring at him. It was only after Sergio had disarmed himself that he felt that intense pressure on him subside, and he realized this was his chance to escape. He took off running, but after only going a few steps, he felt himself get hit from behind, and he pitched forward. He thought he was falling, but he did not hit the ground. Instead, it was like he was being lifted up into the sky. And for a moment, he just careened through the air until abruptly, whatever force was holding him up let go. He fell to the ground and somehow managed to land on his feet, but then once again he was lifted back up. And this time he was thrown even farther through the air before he hit the ground. And then it happened again and again and again. And so as this was happening, Sergio realized these red-eyed creatures must be the ones in control, and they were playing with him. They knew he was trying to escape, but they did not stop him. They just kept picking him up and throwing him forward over and over again. And as all this happened, Sergio began to feel his feet burn. The last thing he remembered was running through a cornfield, and as he did, he realized suddenly that it seemed like he was all alone. The red-eyed creatures were gone. And so Sergio looked over his shoulder, and all he saw was swaying corn stalks in darkness, and for a moment he thought that maybe this was all over. But then, still running, he turned to look straight ahead, and he saw there was this incredible wall of just pure darkness. There was no cornfield, no ground at all. In fact, there was no sky, no moon, no stars, nothing. It was just pure black, like he had reached the actual edge of the world. And then once again, he felt himself begin to rise into the air, and he looked down into this darkness, into this void, and staring back at him were two red, glowing eyes. After that, Sergio passed out, and he had no idea how he wound up 18 hours later on the side of the road, absolutely frozen in fear. No one has ever been able to explain what happened to Sergio, including Sergio himself, but it should be noted that Argentina and South America more broadly is a very well-known hotbed of paranormal activity. Following this incident, Sergio was so traumatized that he retired from the police force. To this day, cops and locals still report seeing strange lights in and around Las Cañas. They wonder if whatever took Sergio Poeta that night is still out there, waiting in the dark forest. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Short: a lone cop vanished after following red taillights into a dark Argentine forest. Corporal Sergio Poeta was the victim, found 18 hours later, dry, silent, and curled beside a road 12 miles away. The strangest clue? His gun and radio were perfectly disassembled, and his footprints stretched 20 feet apart. Police suspected poachers, but there were no tire marks, no car, no struggle. Then Sergio finally spoke. He claimed red-eyed creatures froze his body, controlled his hands, and threw him through the night. He retired soon after. Locals still see strange lights near Las Cañas. What really took him? Watch the full story on our channel.